welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where we explore how businesses can create neuro-inclusive workplace cultures, among many other things. But today I'm joined by Tara May, CEO of Aspiritech and Neurodiversity champion. Tara, welcome.
Thanks, Erica. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, and it's great to have Aspiritech on another podcast. It's wonderful to hear about the work that you guys are doing. But I think we should probably start with yourself, telling us a little bit about you and why neurodiversity is such an important topic for you personally.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for opening the door to that conversation. So I've been CEO of Aspiritech for the past 2 years, but really neurodiversity entered my life roughly about a decade ago with the diagnosis of my son as autistic. And at that point, I knew nothing about the word neurodiversity. I didn't understand the autism spectrum. And quite frankly, it took about 2.5 years for him to get his diagnosis, because in a lot of ways he doesn't present in sort of the standard ways we thought about autism a decade ago. But with his diagnosis, I really fell in love with neurodiversity because I came to understand it as the different ways we all experience the world. And I often liken it to like watching the night sky light up with a constellation of stars, where I started to see the application of neurodiversity all around me, in my family and my loved ones and my friends, but also in the teams I led. I worked in the corporate space in media, digital transformation. And when you start to pay attention to the brains of your team members and how you can support them and help them thrive, especially in a place where we're all learning and changing so rapidly, you come to really appreciate neurodiversity. And so when the opening for CEO of Aspiritech came about, it seemed like the perfect combination for me of what I had built my career in for 25 years in the digital space with something I'm so passionate and such an advocate for in my personal life.
Yeah, and I guess, that's a relatable story for many people, in the sense that there are, with neurodiversity kind of in the social space being spoken about quite a bit more, that actually diagnosis of neurodivergent conditions is becoming more common, particularly of children. And so there's probably people out there who may, even having had an experience of their own of feeling like maybe they never really fit into that corporate culture or that work culture, or they perhaps have a child of their own, or a friend has a child who's neurodivergent. I think it's more commonplace and becoming more commonplace, and is something that they can relate to.
So I think we're having a really special moment in time, right? Where we're getting so much better at diagnosis. And you are right, it's chiefly in children. But what happens, and I hear this story a lot, is that when a child is diagnosed, the parent is often looking at those symptoms, those traits, and seeing themselves reflected there. And the diagnosis that they didn't receive 30, 40 years ago. One example I like to share, Erica, and I do this with permission, is my own dad. So my dad is dyslexic, quite dyslexic. And he was born in 1960. And in kindergarten, when he started school, the first diagnosis he got from the teachers around him was that he was stupid. I mean, he heard that word, and it breaks my heart to think of my 5-year-old dad being told he was stupid, because he's incredibly intelligent, capable. He's my role model for life. And yet that's what diagnosis looked like then, right? And then over time, he came to understand, right, that he was dyslexic. He is not stupid. But to know today that our children are receiving such better diagnosing, and then we can therefore reflect and celebrate and support each other, whether that's in school, personally, or at work, I think is something wonderful. And I often tell people congratulations on their diagnosis, because you're the same person you are the day before your diagnosis. You just know how to support yourself better now.
Yeah, and just a question for you, Tara. Like, I suppose there's also a choice of whether you need a diagnosis. And do organizations, should organizations like require a diagnosis, or is it okay to just have that self-identification of just like, my brain works differently. I work better in these circumstances and these things motivate me and that kind of thing. What's your position on that?
So my personal opinion is that a diagnosis is a wonderful thing for someone as an individual. Whether or not they share that diagnosis is incredibly personal and completely up to them. Some people may not want to share it. They may be very private about it for many reasons, not the least of which is a label, right? Other people may choose to be open about it. For example, in our house, my son's autistic diagnosis is something we never shied away from. We are proudly supportive of that identity, right? So I think that's a very, very personal decision. But when you talk about a workplace, it's completely unneeded, right? A diagnosis can be something you might want to share with your coworkers, your manager, whatever it might be. But the supports that a workplace can offer should exist with or without a diagnosis, with self-diagnosis or professional diagnosis, right? As managers, as leaders, as people who create organizational culture, we can and should be willing to offer whatever supports an employee needs to be successful, regardless of the label or the missing label.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And I think that will resonate with a lot of people, because, even though I think at the moment, and please tell me what you feel is happening in the landscape at the moment, but I feel like we're still with a lot of organizations at this point of, I need a diagnosis, and I need to basically fill a quota with my neurodivergent talent. But actually, why does it have to be, why does it have to be that way? Why can't we? Because also, there's this acknowledgement of actually maybe your neurodiversity population is bigger than you already thought in your existing workforce, right?
This is one of my favorite points to make, Erica, actually, is like, you already have a neurodiverse workforce, whether you know it or not, whether they share it with you or not, whether they know themselves or not. Neurodiversity exists everywhere. Neurodivergent people represent 20% of the population. Chances are, if you have a team that's bigger than 5 people, you have neurodivergent representation on your team already, right? And also, let's like pull aside that diagnosis. All of our brains work differently anyway, right? We've got auditory learners and visual learners and hands-on learners. We have introverts, extroverts, ambiverts, right? We have all these different ways of experiencing the world. And if we can think about how to individualize the work experience to lift up people's true potential, you do not need a diagnosis to do that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use that little quote there as the title, individualizing the workplace. And when it comes to, why is it important that organizations start to really consider neurodiversity? Why is it important for them to be thinking about this?
I appreciate you asking this question because I think it fits into a larger holistic conversation, right? Neurodiversity, right? And so most organizations already believe that it is really important to consider diversity, equity, and inclusion in their efforts. And I'm always the first one to remind people that diversity means a lot of things, right? It means racial and cultural diversity, incredibly important. It means gender diversity at every level of the organization. And I'm a huge advocate for seeing more women rise up above director level, which seems to be sort of our stopping ground, right? It means economic diversity, right? Do all of your people come from, affluent areas and expensive MBA programs, right? That isn't representing diversity. And then, of course, you have the disability community, which is often a completely forgotten part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, and that includes neurodiversity. And I think really thinking about the full breadth of the human experience is what makes an organization strongest. And that's what I'm constantly advocating for. The full breadth of the human experience is complex and nuanced. We are such wonderfully complicated beings, right? We are not just one thing. And to think about that identity and to respect all aspects of the human experience, that's what makes organizations strong. And neurodiversity is certainly one really critical element to that.
Yeah, and it's it's incredibly intersectional with each of those different types of diversity as well, that actually by placing supported, or the hiring process is made easier, and how every one person is supported in the workplace, and it's kind of a frictionless employee experience, that actually, yes, you're making way for neurodivergent people, but also by way of that you're also making the entry into work easier for other types of diversity coming into your business.
There's a wonderful, actually autistic advocate on LinkedIn who calls this the canary in the coal mine concept, right? Which I love. I like to credit her, but also steal it, because it's such a great example of an analogy that explains why thinking about your neurodivergent team members, whether they're candidates or existing employees, actually benefits everyone, right? Because neurodivergent people will sometimes, the problems that everyone has experienced are exacerbated for them, right? The interview system, I think we can all agree the interview system is fairly broken, right? But that hits the neurodivergent population harder. And so if you can call that out, fix it, address it, then you can make things better for everyone. One example I share, when I started at Aspiritech a couple years ago, when I was giving all hands calls, my team members asked me to please provide the information in a written format, in a visual format, and in a recording format that they could re-listen to, right? Because we have different kinds of learners on our team. And I thought to myself, why in 25 years of corporate leadership had I not thought to do that before, right? I mean, when you're managing hundreds, thousands of people, of course, there are all different kinds of learners in that group. But until my Aspiritech team called it out and said, please provide it to us this way, it never even crossed my mind. So in many ways, the autistic team at Aspiritech has made me a much better leader than I was before.
Yeah. And we'll get into that a bit more as well, in terms of your experience of kind of being a leader and your journey personally. But let's just go back to Aspiritech just for a second. How was Aspiritech kind of, what is it? What does Aspiritech do? Because we're talking about neurodiversity, and quite rightly so, about the great things that Aspiritech is doing. But what's the actual business?
Such a great question. So Aspiritech was founded in 2015 by a husband and wife founder team. Brenda and Moshe Weitzberg founded Aspiritech with their own adult autistic son in mind. And he was working in retail jobs that were not commensurate with his intelligence or his capability. And so they started doing some research and actually modeled Aspiritech on a Danish software testing company called Specialisterna. From that kitchen table conversation, Aspiritech has now grown to over 100 team members and about 56 clients and $5 to $6 million in client revenue annually. So we're, a real organization. And I think one of the major changes we've made over the years is that from that foundation in QA testing, which was an excellent start, we've expanded into other business lines. So we now have data services, we're going into automation and development. We have a creative services line, and we have autistic representation at every level of the organization, from the executive team to entry-level analysts, from the HR department to the sales and marketing department and all of operations. And so I think what's shifted, right, is thinking about autistic employment from one dimension and saying Aspiritech's core competency is creating a workplace where autistic and neurodivergent people can thrive in whatever career path they choose, right? And so that's what also has inspired us to offer our training and education to other companies. How can you help your neurodivergent team members and all your team members thrive and achieve that level of employee engagement that we've achieved, right? When we can cite that 96% of our team members say they are highly engaged in their work and in our organization. I know there are many for-profit companies, including ones I've worked at, that would kill for those engagement scores, right?
Yeah.
And that affects retention and revenue and innovation and growth. So really leaning into that employee first model is the heart of what we do. We also provide amazing tech services to our clients, from QA to data to accessibility testing and development. And we have a 9.6 net promoter score. So we see that reflected in the happiness of our clients as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, we can talk about, the ROI of neurodiversity, because I guess, a lot of businesses, or I say a lot of businesses, there may be some kind of CEOs and, top level executives who are thinking, okay, but what's the ROI? Where's the return on investment for us in terms of, putting energy into these neurodiversity initiatives?
So I actually refer to it as a concept called the ROI of kindness, right? And I purposely juxtapose a really hard business centric term with ROI with what many people view as a soft concept, right? Kindness. But really, it's about lifting up your team members and putting them in a position to create the best product, services, and workplace for you, right? And this is a very proven psychological concept. And it becomes even more critical in 2024 or 2025, right? We are moving at the pace of digital and the pace of AI, which means there is constant change and innovation required at every business. If you want your team members to innovate and change, there has to be cultural buy-in at every level. And I think there's an old school mentality of telling people what to do to achieve that change that's been completely disproven. And the best way to affect change is to have your team members do it for you and have it come from the bottom up. And the way you do that is by making sure they are happy, productive, well taken care of, that they have the tools and training and infrastructure to do those things, essentially treating them with kindness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that translates into neurodiversity. The number one accommodation asked for at Aspiritech is kindness. Just give me a little bit of kindness, patience, grace, let me learn, right? And so when you push those two things together, the neurodiversity concept and the kindness concept, really it all comes down to treating employees the way they deserve to be treated. And then they're going to give you back the best ROI for your business that you've ever seen, right? And I've seen this. My job was to come in and help legacy media companies move from an outdated print model to a digital model. That requires a complete cultural transformation. And those very successful transformations were rooted in kindness.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? And when you start to look at business as like a general entity, and you start to look at, what do the shareholders care about? Well, they care about profit. And then you say, okay, so for a business, how are you going to increase that profit over time? And then one of the biggest things is, retaining customers, finding new customers, and to retain customers, you have to have that level of customer service and that level of project delivery and those kinds of things, which having a team that is loyal, that is driven, that is hyper focused, that's what you want, isn't it? You want to have a team that drives client outcomes and therefore drives your profits. So it just seems a logical decision, really.
It really is. And it's Pavlovian, right? I mean, this is not a new scientific principle. If you reward people, they will do more great things, right? And that is a concept that, for whatever reason, has not stuck in corporate culture. And I find it, befuddling. Our chief growth officer, who heads up sales and marketing, as someone I've worked with for well over a decade now. I brought her with me to Aspiritech and asked her to help us grow the business. She has, in her first year, achieved 70% revenue growth. Well, she did not do that by driving her sales team with nastiness, with overwork, with too many hours. She did it by talking to them and saying, what resources do you need? What's working? What's not working? How can we evolve this? What can we improve? Right? And her team absolutely adores her. And she encourages them to stop at 5 o'clock. She encourages them to take weekends. One of them is on maternity leave right now and, was supported throughout her entire pregnancy, and toward the end encouraged to take naps, right? And when you treat team members like that and then see 70% year over year CAGR, that shows you that you do not have to treat people like crap in order to achieve results. And that's, for some reason, a really foreign notion in sales. But it's a great example, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you say, sales is often, seen as the big engine for a lot of businesses. And so I guess that's the best example to give people to relate to. And when it comes to the culture, we've kind of, in that example, briefly touched on kind of team culture. But how has Aspiritech built an inclusive workplace culture? What values are at its core?
So one of our core values is community, right? And this is really important to us. And you mentioned intersectionality early on, which I think is really important for neurodivergent team members. So a good example of this is we have employee resource groups that really represent that intersectionality and foster community. We know, for example, that 1 in 4 of our team members identifies as LGBTQIA+. And so that employee resource group is very well attended. We have an autistic advocacy group. We have a parents and caregivers groups. We have representation for people over 40. We have a chronic illness ERG, right? So these places where we can create community are really critical to us. Another one of our core values is authenticity. So we don't ask our team members to mask themselves, which is often something, autistic people are forced into doing. We wear our identities on our sleeves. We share what is going on, right? So a good example, when I started 2 years ago, surprised by just starting menopause. And I shared it with my team members, and I shared the extreme anxiety that it gave me and sort of my adjustment to those new hormones entering my body. And I got so many thank yous from the team, and it started and opened up a great conversation about anxiety and aging and all the many things that happen to us as humans. And then I would say a third one is really sort of radical honesty, right? We try to act with a lot of humility from every level of the organization, including myself. So we have an atmosphere where it's okay for someone to say something they don't like. And I think so many organizations are forced into this place where employees are welcome to give praise, less welcome to give criticism, right? And that's just not our jam. We say it out loud because we hope that means we can fix those things, right? It's the first step toward making it better, is saying it out loud, talking about it. So those are just a few examples, I think, of the kind of culture that we have and that we try to. I will say one that we do not have, and I feel very strongly about this. We don't call each other family, right? Workplaces are not families. We are coworkers. We are a community, absolutely, right? but we are colleagues and a community that's working to lift each other up. But I also expect them to have lives outside of work, and that is their family, right? So it's, it's a balancing act between recognizing that we are a workplace, but a workplace with a really high expectations for our culture, our community, and the way we treat each other.
Yeah, and as you say, those don't apply just to kind of the scenario of being, a majoritively neurodivergent workforce, but actually, that makes everyone feel included, makes that they feel that they have a voice, allows them to bring as much of themselves to work as they wish to bring, and leave, a piece of their private life and, their kind of their person at home if need be. So yeah, and when it comes to kind of the biggest kind of areas, key things that have had the biggest impact on Aspiritech's neuro-inclusive initiatives. Obviously, you've mentioned the ERGs and we've talked about the values. Are there other key things that have really made a big impact on creating that culture?
One of the things I'm most grateful for at Aspiritech is our autism advocacy group. So this is a group of people who look both internally and externally at what we can do to advocate for the autistic community. So internally, they will do things like review our processes and say, are we being as neuro-inclusive as we can? Are we thinking about the way our team members are going to process this, or the multiple outcomes that different people might have as they process it? They'll make suggestions for how to address sensory issues, emotional dysregulation. They'll look at our language and our use of language and help us adapt it and evolve it. They'll look at our social media and our presence and say, are we representing the autistic community in a way that we want to? And that lived experience from self-advocates, to me, is just incredibly critical to our culture and to our mission. And they also act as ambassadors outside of our community. So I've been really, really vocal about making sure that I, as a neurotypical person, am not the only one representing Aspiritech. Conferences, at speaking opportunities, at advocacy opportunities, are Aspiritech ambassadors that have the lived experience of being autistic are just as front and center. Now, sometimes the CEO does talk, right? Like that's a thing that's going to happen, right? But I always am offering up the opportunities to our team members who can so much better than myself represent the autistic perspective.
I think that's so interesting, like actually incredibly interesting to be able to have that advocacy group. Because normally when you talk about employee advocacy, it comes from a marketing perspective of having employees out in the, in the industry that are kind of championing the conversations that your business participates in and, promoting the business. Because we know now that in marketing, personal branding and leveraging personal brands is, the way forward. And so when you start to talk about employee advocacy in the internal sense, that's the piece that I think, that's the other side of employee advocacy internally that organizations don't necessarily consider. They see it as this potentially this outward facing, look at the great people that we have in our organization and, they're advocating for your business. But actually, how can you build an advocacy program that is for the employees, not just outward facing? And I find that really interesting because you don't necessarily see that an awful lot, whether it's for autism or whether it's for women or whether it's, just a panel of a diverse mix of people who are, being your advocates on multiple different topics. That maybe that's something that organizations should be thinking about.
Yeah, and leaders need to be willing to listen, right? You have to be able to listen to the feedback. And this is something I say over and over again, right? It's one thing to collect feedback. It is a complete different and more important thing to act on it, right? Or at least to respond to it. I mean, one of the things I constantly say to the team is, First of all, there's 100 of us. We are never going to all agree on the perfect thing to do, right? But we can all share our perspectives. And it's really important to know that your perspective was not only shared, but heard, right? And then say, okay, what can we easily enact? Then what may we be able to enact, but it's going to take more work and more time. And that's okay. Let's work toward it. And then what's maybe not possible, right? Not all things are possible. I would love to give a 20% raise out every year. It's not possible, right? So it's what take the feedback, right? Digest the feedback, learn from the feedback, and act on what you can. And if you can't, explain why. Talk to your team member about it, right? And that all comes from a place of humility with leadership.
And just on that leadership piece then, for yourself, what are some of, we've already briefly mentioned this, but I just want to come back to it, is what lessons have you learned as a business leader, going on this journey of neuro-inclusion, or, of person into a business, because obviously this Aspiritech's been around for a while, but you've been around for 2 years. What are some things that you learned that maybe others might be interested to hear, or you think they should hear?
Well, so what I will say first is that this is my first CEO role. So I had come from corporate leadership roles, but this was my first time ever being in the seat, right?
Yeah.
And I often tell people that this role at Aspiritech 2 years in is the most challenging, but also the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life, right? And I think a big part of that is knowing that I am waking up every day and putting the mission front and center. And having that is unprecedented in my career. And I think if leaders can find that, if they can find what their mission and purpose is, it is so rewarding and so driving. It really helps you move forward, right? But it also can be a very heavy weight to bear. And I definitely, for my first 6 months to a year, and even still sometimes now, struggled to figure out how to carry that weight, right? It was like, I sometimes was taking it too much, right? Like not being able to sleep, for instance, right? Or not being able to put down the work. And so figuring out what your purpose and mission is, and then how to carry it gracefully, I think has been one of the biggest pieces of learning in my journey. And the second is certainly humility, right? When you are where the responsibility starts and ends, that is a great privilege. You get to make a lot of decisions. It's also heavy, right? And you are going to do things wrong. You are going to make mistakes. But the ability to stop and say, okay, I made the mistake. What am I going to do to fix it? How am I going to do to change going forward? Is really critical. And remembering to give that grace to the leaders on your team who are coming with you on this journey, I think is really important. And then thirdly, I think at every organization, you have to figure out who's in it, right, with you, and who are your core people that you can count on. And for me, the autistic community at Aspiritech has changed and grown and transformed the company in a way that I think many neurotypical people would have been jarred by or scared by. And that's counter to some of the stereotypes you might hear or know about autistic people, right? So that open mind and being willing to have high expectations of people, I think is a really critical part of being a leader. But you also have to be willing to offer the support and resources they might need in order to achieve those expectations you've set out for them. And this is something, I never ever think of my coworkers as family. Like I said, I just don't. I don't think that's a good way to view business. I view them as colleagues. I view them as trusted colleagues, often as friends. But to be in it together, to transform an organization, is something really special. And I think you have to stop and give the team the opportunity to reflect on how much they've done and what amazing things they've accomplished. while still looking forward. And that's a balancing act.
Yeah, and I think from everything that you've said there, it's a common challenge of anyone in this field that actually, it can be an emotional burden. There is a heaviness and a responsibility to it. But I think, as you said, the rewards, not only personally, but also for the business, definitely outweigh the not the downsides, but it definitely makes it worth it. So when it comes to other organizations and looking at their neuro-inclusive initiatives and goals, which areas do you think they struggle with the most when it comes to maybe even like neurodivergent talent through like the hiring and onboarding process? Because I think one of the conversations that we've had over the last 2 years is people go, yeah, we understand why we need it and blah, 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 but the how, they're really missing the how. So what do you see happening there?
Yeah, so there's a few areas that we really emphasize when we are talking to organizations about how to be more inclusive around neurodiversity. One certainly is the hiring process. And one of the most critical components there is that the hiring process is built to showcase your own ability to sell yourself, right? But a lot of times the work that needs to be done once you get hired is not sales at all, right? So I gave a presentation to a group of CEOs, and I said, you're going to interview with me, stand up, show me what you're going to do. And so, of course, this male CEO walks over to me and shakes my hand and makes eye contact and introduces himself and tells me his position. And he does so with confidence. And I say, okay, now can you sit down and code me a website? And he's like, no. And I said, well, what do the two have to do with each other? Right. And it was very much a light bulb moment that often the interview has nothing to do with the work at hand. And so really thinking about that and being cognizant about it and saying, okay, what do I actually need to see from these neurodivergent employees to demonstrate that they can do the job? And it's generally not eye contact and a firm handshake, right? So that's something that we always talk about. Another area we talk about is clear communications and expectations, right? So many times, and actually I see this with neurotypical people too, people are thrown into a job and given very little guidance at all, right? And this can be especially problematic for neurodivergent people who may benefit from really clear guidelines and expectations. So we talk about that, guidelines, expectations, communication. We talk about performance management, right? Many people dance around performance management, whereas an autistic person may really benefit from direct feedback, direct, honest feedback, right? And I could probably go on for another hour, Erica. I won't. But those are, you can see already, right? 3 really critical areas to employee success that not only can be really beneficial for neurodivergent people, they can be really beneficial for everyone if you can improve them.
Absolutely. And I guess the other thing about the other challenge that we've identified talking with a lot of these companies is performance management of neurodivergent talent. How do you find the balance of evaluating their performance, which means that you can successfully assess whether it's a challenge of their neurodivergency or whether it's actually just their performance that they're just not performing. I think there's still a conversation to be had around that for a lot of these organizations in how they, navigate that process, because they also don't want to get caught out doing the wrong thing or, being discriminative in their process.
And sometimes, you do have to address performance issues in all people, right? In every single company, everywhere. Sometimes someone gets into a job that is not a good position for them. And one of my perspectives actually is that it can be kind to let someone go, right? Mm-hmm. People want to be successful. They want to make a meaningful contribution in their work. And if that role is not right for them and is one where they're going to continue to struggle and continue to have sort of mental anguish, and it's not going to work for the manager, and the teammates are having to carry the weight that they shouldn't have to carry, it can be kind to say, this is not the job for you, and let someone go, right? And even that can be done in a compassionate, thoughtful, human-centric way. Performance management is real.
Yeah, and as you say, it goes back to those things of clear communication and setting those expectations from the very beginning, in that job description, and then through, communications with a line manager, that actually that hopefully should resolve that issue and make it easier.
Right. And it's not kind to have someone languishing around flailing for 6 months. Like, that's not good for anyone's mental health.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not. And also, the kind of the disciplinary process, it can be a long one anyway. In
Yeah.
the UK, in the UK system, it takes minimum of 6 months to go through a disciplinary process. So, you don't want to be keeping, as a business person, you don't want to be keeping people in your business who aren't helping to drive your business. And
No,
so,
because other teammates end up carrying that weight, right?
Mhm.
And so then you're not being kind or fair to those people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, Tara, we're running out of time, actually. We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we hit some key points for, this discussion. For Aspiritech, obviously, you've done a lot internally. There's a lot of great stuff. You seem to have neurodiversity cracked down, or close enough to perfect as you can possibly get to at this stage. Um, how do you support and assist other companies then with their neurodiversity initiatives?
Yeah. So thank you for saying that. And I think, perfect is a journey, right? So
Mhm.
we're making progress. But what we do seem to have done is cracked a code for employee engagement and potential, right? For neurodivergent team members and neurotypical alike. And so what we offer at Aspiritech is a program called NeuroGrowth. So for organizations that have neurodiversity hiring initiatives, or who want to support the neurodiversity of their existing team members, we offer a great curriculum for helping make your organization more inclusive. And this ranges from live presentations, both by myself, but also by those Aspiritech ambassadors who come in and do an autistic panel, to a complete learning management system filled with dozens of modules on how to manage neurodivergent team members, how to do performance evaluations in a really friendly way, how to think about hiring, how to think about communication in an all hands capacity, in an email, Slack capacity, in a digital capacity, how to think about accommodations and your office environment, just all the things that you could possibly do to make your organization have the best culture and atmosphere possible for absolutely everyone on your team.
Yeah, and by the sounds of the topics that get covered, that actually, these are some very simple things that don't necessarily need an awful lot of investment initially, but they are small tweaks. And as you said, it's that progress over perfection initially, that you're trying to support organizations with.
And I think team members really appreciate progress, right? They don't expect perfection, but they appreciate progress. And 90% of the recommendations we make, the action items that we give people, are free to implement, right? They just, all they require is a bit of thoughtfulness. And actually, once you start to open your mind to how to be supportive of neurodivergent team members, you'll be amazed at how much it benefits everyone.
And Tara, just so that I understand, with this neurogrowth program, does an organization have to be at a certain state of maturity with their neuroinclusion, or can they be at the very beginning?
Right at the beginning. Yeah, we love to help people at the very beginning, right? A lot of what we're seeing right now is the very initial emergence of neurodiversity ERGs. It's the first time in my career that I've seen this starting to happen, right? And it's really fascinating to see these employees saying, we exist we're here and we at least want to be considered, right? And they're not asking for much, but consideration and representation is powerful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And for the types of roles that are kind of best suited for this kind of program, is it HR? Is it anyone across a business?
So our initial point of contact is often either HR or a chief diversity officer or something akin to that, right? But then we end up usually being fairly hands-on with the managers, right? Because your managers are your most direct line to the entire organization.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. We often talk about, the importance of line management in any kind of culture change program. So that makes complete sense.
Yes.
And for Aspiritech, what are the future goals? What are you guys looking to do next?
Well, there's a few things, right? We've widely expanded our program lines. As I was mentioning to you earlier, we're going into cybersecurity and AI in 2025, which we're really excited about. We're building our first ever Aspiritech owned and built product, which is actually an AI neuro-inclusive bot that will give you tips as a manager on how to help your neurodivergent team members and for neurodivergent team members to support themselves. So we're pretty excited about that. And we just have a lot of growth ahead of us in 2025. We also have the Aspiritech Academy, which is for neurodivergent young adults who are prepping for their careers, and seeing the expansion and growth of that from 2022 when it launched to 2025 when we're going to do a record number of classes has been really exciting for us as well.
Oh my God, there's lots of stuff going on there.
And actually,
I'm so excited to, especially that neuro-inclusion bot, that's going to be really game changing for a lot of these line managers who are like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. How do I, interact with this person? So that I think is going to be an incredible tool for us to
We're excited about it. And you know what? Part of the large language model building is our podcast interviews. So we feed them into it, and all these discussions we've had over the years are all fed into teaching the large language model about neuro-inclusivity.
Amazing. I'm so excited. I can't wait to see that come to fruition. But Tara, if we could leave our audience, our listeners, with one last piece of advice around building neuro-inclusive workplaces, what would that be?
So I'd like to throw back to something I said earlier, which is that our number one requested accommodation at Aspiritech is kindness. And if you can pause and be thoughtful about your own needs, think about yourself for a minute. What do you need to be the most successful person you can be, right? I, for example, am not a morning person. Do not get me started at 6 a.m. I will not be my best self. And give yourself that grace, give yourself kindness. That's a great place to start. And it will remind you to offer that same grace and kindness to the people around you. And really, that's what the neurodiversity movement is about. It's about saying we are all valuable, we all matter. And that applies to every single one of us.
Well, Tara, thank you so much for today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and I'm sure we could carry on talking about neurodiversity and the great stuff that you guys are doing at Aspiritech. What we'll do is, for anyone listening who wants to find out more, we will share links to get in touch with Tara if you feel like it, or if you want to learn more about Aspiritech, then the Aspiritech website in the podcast description. But for now, if you're still looking for more actionable insights and advice from expert practitioners across any number of workforce topics, then make sure to sign up for the monthly UWI newsletter and also our new industry magazine, which covers all range of topics, but the first issue is about neurodiversity, so this is perfect timing. And we will be sharing a little bit more about Aspiritech in that issue as well. And we will provide the link to get registered in the podcast description, or just look out for the next UWI event. We host them regularly, so visit the uwi.com. But for today, Tara, it's been wonderful to chat to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Erica.